to a series where I do a deep, but not necessarily scholarly, dive into a particular topic. This week we are continuing with the topic of physics, but starting with a... excuse me. Throat is a little bit post-nasal drippy. So yes, we are continuing with the first topic of physics, and we are moving on to our second sort of subunit, if you will, which is going to be on how stuff exists. Now, I should note, first off, this is a double feature this week, because I had migraines last week when I would normally be recording this. And yeah, so it's a double feature, which is great. It also means that this is going to be a bit different than usual. At least the next one will be, because I'll be a lot more tired. It also means a bit more cramped because I had less time to do stuff like research and write scripts. So, that's thing number one. Thing number two, because I am starting at this stage, which is a very advanced and technical stage, a lot of it is probably going to go over people's heads at least a little. I am explaining this in the order that I think these things should be taught to an adult audience. In other words, this is how I would teach things in school if everyone had a solid, mature understanding of how things work. So, third disclaimer. A lot of this is very new information compared to other stuff. A lot of it is still subject to change. As mentioned in last week's episode, we still do not have a functioning theory of quantum gravity. We still do not have a unified theory of everything. And we still don't have a reasonable or functioning explanation for why quantum events work the way that they do. So, for this subunit, when we talk about quantum stuff, please know that it is all just from our understanding as of early 2023. Which is to say, it's from my understanding of our understanding as of early 2023. And all of it could very well be subject to change as we learn more and as we develop more robust theories. So, this first episode of the subunit, which is the, I believe, 9th episode of the Infodump overall, is going to focus primarily on the most basic and fundamental level of existence. So let's get into it. To us, living in our macroscopic, four-dimensional world, everything is macroscopic and four-dimensional, and we like to think of it that way. But the truth is, things are more complex than that. Some people will say, per string theory, that there are actually over a dozen different dimensions of space-time. Others will say that, maybe there's 5, and there's this sort of sideways dimension that is what allows us to have multiple parallel universes per the many worlds interpretation, or rather, per some people's interpretation of the many worlds interpretation. We don't know. We know that there are at least 4 dimensions. But what we do know is that what we see is the result of many, many more complicated processes at work on levels that we can barely even comprehend once we've controlled for scale. At its core, everything is a waveform. That might sound weird. If you look at your hand, it looks like a hand, not like a wave, unless you have taken way too many mushrooms, or done way too much weed, and you are now tripping fucking balls out of your mind and just on another level in terms of altered states of consciousness. Who knows, maybe this is great listening/watching if you are in such an altered state of consciousness. I have never partaken in such things myself, so I can't say whether my rants and ramblings are particularly entertaining to those on a different mental level in that sense. But what I mean when I say that is that the core of everything, not just physical matter, but energy as well, is a waveform. Now, when it comes to physical matter, this probably seems very counterintuitive, and that is something that we will get to later on, is how we build up from this very basic level to, well, fingers and toes and hands and rocks and all the other stuff that we think of as physical. But at its base level, the universe is probabilistic in nature. Those waves, fundamentally, are probability waves. We can have waves in the macroscopic world as well, but when you are dealing with minutia, with minute forces, with these microscopic quantum events, fundamentally, the waves we are talking about are probability waves. Which is to say, the peaks are where you are most likely to find something, usually a particle that carries a force, and the troughs are where you are least likely to find it. Sort of. There's more there, because being waves, they can interfere, cancel each other out. So, a very common and somewhat famous experiment that proves what's called particle-wave duality is the double-slit experiment. You can send electrons through two very thin slits, and what you get on the other side is an interference pattern, which is to say, the probability waveforms of where those electrons would land interfered with each other and canceled out in some areas and strengthened in others. The universe is fundamentally probabilistic, and we know it because of that sort of experiment. While it's certainly true that we can't destroy or create energy and matter out of nothing, experiments like the double-slit experiment and the reality of those interference patterns shows us that it is, in theory, possible to create a dead zone of probability. That does not mean you are erasing something from existence. You're just forcing the non-zero probabilities in other places to have a greater impact as a whole. In theory, in absolute theory, you could create a waveform to perfectly cancel out the probability waveform of something else. However, doing so would not be pretty. At best, the result would be a complete violation of any sort of physical laws that we currently understand and force us to throw our hands up in the air. I say at best because that is the simplest result. At worst, you can see this as essentially what happens when matter and antimatter collide. It creates this huge sort of glitch in the matrix almost, where these two things cancel each other out, and the result, in order to preserve the laws of conservation of matter and energy, is well, an explosion. Not necessarily a simple, straightforward explosion, but some form of dramatic release of all this energy that would be cancelled. It's not pretty. So, the double slit experiment is how we know that stuff is probabilistic in nature. And those interference patterns, as I just went into, can make themselves known in very destructive ways, but also very constructive ways. That interference is what gives rise to things like electron orbitals. When you see electrons orbiting an atom's nucleus in the way they do, they're not really orbiting. The quantum model of the electron cloud model, of the atom, the electron cloud model, is ironically similar to a sort of inverted plum pudding model. The electrons have the probability and possibility of existing just about anywhere, but they are most likely by a dramatic margin to exist along the paths of what we have come to know as orbitals. Specifically, which one they are most likely to be on is determined by their level of energy. The universe, being probabilistic, almost never completely rules something out. When we have these physical laws, they are still obeyed by the universe, just in weird and probabilistic ways. We don't know for sure how the universe came to be, but our best bet is that the Big Bang was caused by essentially randomness, by a particle-antiparticle pair type situation just springing into the void. And from that origin, everything else flowed. That fundamental probabilistic nature of the universe meant that there being a non-zero chance of stuff existing, per Murphy's Law, stuff eventually, circumstantially had to exist. Now, you can make whatever sort of religious arguments you want to make here. You can say that the Big Bang was caused or sparked by the divine. That is entirely your choice. I will not begrudge you. I will not think that you are less of a person or foolish or anything like that. I would certainly hope that no one else watching this video thinks so. I myself am, generally speaking, an atheist. The closest I come to religion is more deism than anything resembling an organized religion. But even then, I'm very meh. So, I would just like to take this quick moment to say, if you are a religious fundamentalist, and you believe the literal text of whatever your holy text is, you can find ways to read it as metaphor or as the divine trying to explain things in terms that primitive humans without advanced science would understand, and the Big Bang still works. It still makes sense. Let there be light. Well, the first thing to happen was this huge release of energy, a lot of which falls into the electromagnetic spectrum, specifically what we now know as the cosmic microwave background, CMB, or CMW. Or CBR, cosmic background radiation. It's got too many names, really. You look at that, And you can read that as, okay, yeah, let there be light kind of applies to this, doesn't it? So, for now, we're going to get into all of the forces and splitting off and all of that next episode, but I just want to be real clear right now. As best as we can understand, the universe started because variables eventually aligned in a way that allowed it to happen. Whether that was the result of some god or something, who knows? We'll never know, because we can't look any further back in time than the Big Bang, no matter how hard we fucking try. What's important is to realize that that fundamental probabilistic start echoes through to today. We can see on the edges of black holes particle and antiparticle pairs that have net zero energy coming into existence. This is what I meant when I said that you can have a thing that cancels out perfectly the waveform of something else. Because there is a net of zero energy, positive energy and negative energy, the spontaneous creation of these particle-antiparticle pairs is allowed by the law of conservation of energy and the law of conservation of matter. Yes, it's ridiculous. Yes, it makes no sense at first. But when you consider that these only really spring into existence, as far as we've been able to detect thus far, on the edge of black holes, which is, where relativity and quantum theory start fighting, it makes a bit more sense, because that is where our traditional understanding of the universe, both in terms of quantum physics and in terms of relativity, starts, collapsing in on itself, much like the black holes themselves do. Unfortunately, there isn't much that we can do to stop that from happening, to keep the black hole of quantum gravity from swallowing up everything we think we understand. But we do know that those situations, that particular environment, if you will, is conducive to those particle-antiparticle pairs forming. One of the pair will fall into the black hole, causing a release of energy in the form of Hawking radiation. That is how we know that these particle-antiparticle pairs even happen at all, is by observing the Hawking radiation. Because we sure as hell aren't getting close enough to a black hole to fucking test that. Ever. You'd be spaghetti before you knew it. Well, actually, probably not before you knew it, because time goes fucky in gravity as well. It is space-time being modified, after all, rather than just space. Time slows to a standstill, from your perspective, from, the relativistic perspective anyway. Thinking about time in a relativistic framework is always going to be a little bit brain-twisty. Don't worry about it. We'll get there. Now, by looking at this probabilistic, spontaneous nature of reality, we start to understand why it is that those probability waveforms matter. Because you can have a particle that is incredibly likely to be in place A, but has a slight, non-zero chance of being in place B, a very long distance away. Or even, very long usually in the context of quantum mechanics rather than in our macroscopic context, which, when translated, means a couple inches maybe. But because everything is probabilistic, that probability waveform is not a guarantee of where it will always be. Just because you looked at it now and it was there, does not mean that it will still be there the next time you look. It could have, because of the probability, ended up in place B. When something like that happens, we call it quantum tunneling. We do not know how or why we see quantum tunneling happen at all. We know that it works with that probability wave framework, but we don't know why it actually, happens. We don't know if there is some sort of trigger that causes it to occur, or if it really is just a matter of the universe basically constantly refreshing itself and constantly reevaluating from those probability waves where the particle is. Or even if the particle is anything but an illusion that we perceive from the probability wave. It's impossible to really know. We ourselves are, as far as we can tell, made up of particles created by those probability waves. So of course, we can't really tell because we are the result of the system that we are trying to figure out the workings of. We can't disentangle ourselves. Now, the crucial thing to keep in mind here is that because everything, fundamentally, is a probability wave, that also means that when you have these complex systems of multiple particles, you have a probability wave, or more accurately, a probability system for that, system of multiple particles. And when two systems that each have multiple particles interact, their waveforms become linked. Not permanently, but they essentially are overlapping for a time. And that overlap is really what gives rise to the system waveforms in the first place. The overlap between the two different particle waveforms helps create the system waveform. And then we build on that and build on that and build on that, and eventually you get up to macroscopic things like us, where the waveform is entirely dependent on the coherence of every subpart. In other words, we are able to exist physically because the odds of any individual part of our larger waveform changing enough that it destabilizes the whole are functionally zero. Again, not actually zero. But when you multiply a quadrillionth by a quadrillionth times, and yes, these are exaggerated numbers, don't at me, but when you do that, the result is numbers that are so small they cannot be reasonably expected to happen within the lifespan of the universe as far as we have been able to calculate it. Which is what I mean when I say functionally zero. Yes, it could happen. It is entirely possible. The odds are very much against it ever happening before we are all inevitably returned to the entropic void. So, what does that mean for us? Well, that helps explain, in part, why it seems like quantum phenomena are so linked to observation. When we observe, we are putting ourselves or our observation system into a quantum system with the thing that we are observing. In other words, we are causing that particle's wavelength, or waveform rather, to overlap with our own waveforms. The result is that we will perceive the particle as being in the place that that overlap occurs. The world as a whole is the result of a bunch of different overlapping waveforms. The reason we see so much consistency and constancy in the macroscopic scale is because all of those waveforms are overlapping so much from all the different interactions that have to go on that there isn't any room within the waveform for smaller waveforms to really differ by much. That is probably part of why quantum behavior just doesn't seem to happen significantly in large complex systems. You can try and induce it, but the bigger and more complex the system, the harder it is to actually catch any quantum phenomena. So hopefully that has helped you understand what exactly this whole probabilistic wave thing is, and why it matters, and why we don't see it on a macroscopic scale. So, thank you very much for watching and or listening, and I will see you all next time.